reopened earlier this week when Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe made a visit to a controversial World War II memorial, which honored kamikaze fighters, a gesture which many U.S. officials took as a slight to the history of conflict between the two nations. But perhaps a far more serious regional dispute that has flared up within the same region is the maritime disputes that have been going on between Japan and China, particularly centering around the islands in the East China Sea. According to the New York Times of February 1st, 2014, these islands, 26 of which are known to the Japanese as the Senkaku Islands and to the Chinese as the Diaoyu Islands, are uninhabited but very rich with resources and have changed hands between the two nations over 40 times in the last 2 centuries. However, recently this conflict has reignited with more tension than ever, as for the last 6 months, China has repeatedly infracted upon the airspace that is claimed by Japan and recognized by the rest of the international community. However, considering that earlier this week, President Obama announced that he would make his first trip to Japan this coming April, our president is likely to find himself caught in a game of cat and mouse between China, our largest trading partner, and Japan, the second largest free market economy in the world, with the United States in a precarious position in between, forcing us to ask today's question: should the U.S. be doing more to quell tensions between China and Japan? And the answer to this question is a resounding yes, because by solving this conflict peacefully, the United States has an opportunity to quell future threats. And we can see that this is the case by first examining how the United States already has a military obligation to Japan. Second, that ultimately, the United States can showcase their diplomacy to counter Chinese militarization. And finally, that they can set a powerful precedent for future regional disputes. We can first see that it is well in the United States' best interest to intervene in this conflict, first and foremost because they may already have to as a result of pre-existing military contracts between Japan and the United States. In fact, the Christian Science Monitor of January 2nd, 2014 recalls that in 1970, a bilateral protection agreement was signed by Japanese and U.S. leadership, Clause 32 of which indicated that should the Japan be the victim of an attack from another country, the United States is compelled to come to their military aid. In addition, not only does this compel the United States to act militarily, it also has important ramifications for the future with potential relations between China and the United States as well. However, PhD of Global Security, Jimmy Reisel of Harvard University told the New York Times on February 10th, 2014, that this puts the U.S. in an incredibly perilous situation because having the backing of the world's largest military could cause Japan to act with hubris. While Japan may have little to fear with the assurance of United States help, the United States, should conflict arise, has not only military expectations of participation, but would also put us in a terrible position for future negotiations with China, our largest global trading partner. As a result, it is essential that the United States intervenes voluntarily now, rather than waiting until we are compelled to by international contract. We can further see why it is in the United States' best interest to intervene further in this Japan-China conflict, because it gives the United States an effort to showcase their diplomacy and counter increasing militarization from China. While China claims all of the South China Sea, their claim is not recognized by most of the international community. However, for the last 6 months, they have had little ramifications for their increasing infractions upon international law. As Reuters of January 1st, 2014 notes, China has been flexing its military muscles for months now, most dramatically at the end of last year when they debuted a fleet of 12 nuclear submarines, announcing themselves as one of only 3 nations in the entire world with a nuclear navy. In addition, China has been formally warned for both trespassing upon the air zone that is claimed by Japan, as well as crossing international maritime laws. However, it might be the United States' exclusive role to arbitrate that which other bodies cannot. Because according to the aforementioned Reuters article, last week, the Philippines, in a separate maritime dispute, filed a formal complaint to the UN, and China firmly ignored it, claiming that they would not participate in any UN arbitration. This indicates that the United States may be one of the exclusive bodies that has the power to showcase our diplomacy and ultimately find a successful, peaceful resolution between these two nations. Ultimately, the United States should intervene as a way to both reassert our diplomatic power and also know that the militarization and threats of China has not gone unnoticed in a public sphere. Finally, we can see why it benefits the United States to intervene in this conflict because it sets an important precedent for future disputes. The Boston Globe of January 3rd, 2014 notes that while the China-Japan dispute is the most prominent, China is also embroiled in territorial disputes of other islands, most located in the South China Sea, with nations ranging from Brunei to Taiwan to Malaysia to Indonesia to South Korea. All of these disputes regard very resource-rich territories, and should the United States fail to quell China's power with Japan, it could set a dangerous precedent of sovereignty over other regional disputes as well. As the Boston Globe continues to note, ultimately, the United States should step in now to reassert the fact that the South Pacific nations have an ally in the United States, a crucial tenet of President Barack Obama's Asian pivot, an effort to reassert our friendship and offset China's power in the region. However, as the Christian Science Monitor of February 3rd, 2014 notes, if China is allowed to continue, they could gain over $500 billion of annual resources from these islands, which would radically restructure the economic power dynamics, both within the region, as well as between the United States and China as well, illustrating that the U.S. has far more to gain from setting a powerful precedent of peace now, rather than waiting for China to gain the upper hand in future disputes beyond that of China and Japan. Thus, returning to today's question, should the U.S. be doing more to quell tensions between China and Japan? The answer is a clear yes, because ultimately it could save the U.S. from facing other threats in the future. We saw this first by examining the United States' military obligation to Japan. Second, that they can showcase their diplomacy to counter the militant China. And finally, that it would set a key precedent for future disputes. Ultimately, President Shinzo Abe apologized for his visit to the World War II memorial, and ultimately it will largely probably be forgotten within a few weeks, illustrating that it is a key way to resolve these conflicts is that someone is willing to take the first step.
Well, first off, congratulations on making it to finals. You did an excellent job. I just have a couple of questions to clarify some things. Initially, in your introduction, you explained about the tensions between Japan and China, but then later on you mentioned in the Philippines was also embroiled in this dispute. So how does the Philippines change the power dynamic?
The Philippines conflict is actually involving islands in the South China Sea, whereas the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands are in the East China Sea. There we go. So it's just an example of China's status quo of operation for disputes.
All right, thank you. And then in your first point, you stated that the United States needs to try and avoid this issue in order to ensure that don't get caught up in a war with Japan and China. Given that the United States and Kerry has officially stated that they will side with China, how likely is it, do you think, that China would actually go to war and risk a war with the United States, considering you stated they were one of the United States' most significant trading partners?
I think that it's not in the United States' position to take the Chinese peaceful stance for granted, considering earlier this week they have already ignored formal warnings from the United States Assistant Secretary of the South Pacific about the airspace and maritime laws. So clearly, I think whether or not they're willing to escalate towards full-out war, they're clearly willing to push back against American forces.
Okay, and considering Japan does not have a military of its own, so therefore cannot be the aggressor, the only way the U.S. could be involved in a war with China is if China were to be the aggressor in this situation. And although you stated they are pushing back, there is a difference between pushing back and all-out war, so I was just wondering how likely would it be that China would actually go to all-out war and the U.S. would actually be embroiled in a conflict in this region?
I think the likelihood of all-out war between China and America is extremely low. At the same time, the importance of the United States showing a strong symbolic force that they're not going to let China walk all over them or their allies in Japan is probably equally important for asserting our value as an ally internationally.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. And then moving down to your second point, you stated that because China has violated the Law of the Sea Treaty and maritime laws, that China had repercussions through the United Nations, but they haven't been effective. If the United Nations as a neutral party hasn't been effective, how much more effective would the United States actually be, considering they are very biased in this situation?
I think the United States would be more powerful simply because they're not neutral, which is to say that the United Nations only has as much power as individuals give it, meaning if China doesn't want to engage in arbitration, the United States can't do anything. Whereas should the United States want to create repercussions for China for not engaging in U.S. negotiations, the United States definitely has the power to do that economically.
Okay, and then finally, you stated that the United States should get involved and should do more. What exactly should the U.S. do? How much can they do without China being willing to cooperate, as you've stated numerous times?
Well, I think one of the key steps to start this off is that while we have asserted our allegiance to Japan, there has been almost no communication directly between the United States and China. So the first steps would be a direct dialogue between officials of both nations, simply to see where negotiations lead, because right now we're not even clear what's at stake between the two nations.
All right, but if China is not willing to listen to the United Nations, would China be open and willing to negotiations, considering they want this location right now and they are able to be in that area without any kind of repercussions? What motivation does China have to actually get involved in negotiations with the U.S.?
I think the exact same reason that we are liable to have negotiations with them, which is that the counter argument is that we are China's largest trading partner, so we hold a specific clout internationally that organizations like the UN only have in terms of symbolic diplomatic power.
Thank you.
Yeah.